In 1462, a Turkish army of 90,000 men marched into Wallachia, expecting conquest. What they found instead was a forest of the dead. 20,000 impaled corpses rotting in the summer heat, arranged in rows stretching toward the horizon. The Sultan turned back. Vlad had won without a battle. The smell reached them first. Miles before the walls of Targovishte became visible on the horizon, a sweetness crept into the air, thick and wrong, settling into the throats of 90,000 soldiers like a warning they could not yet name. Mehmed, the Conqueror, rode at the head of the greatest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled against a Christian enemy. He had shattered the walls of Constantinople. He had ended an empire that stood for 1,000 years. He had never known retreat. The summer heat pressed down on the column as they advanced through the devastated Wallachian countryside, past poisoned wells and burned villages, through a land that seemed to have swallowed its own people. Then the crows appeared, thousands of them, circling in black spirals against the pale sky, their calls drowning out the steady march of boots and hooves. The column slowed. Soldiers began to murmur prayers, and then they saw it. Stakes rose from the earth like a forest planted by devils, stretching toward the city walls and beyond, row after row disappearing into the haze of distance. 20,000 bodies hung upon them, men and women and children. Ottoman prisoners in the center, arranged by rank, their uniforms still visible beneath the rot. Wallachian boyars on the flanks, their fine robes shredded, their noble blood now black and crawling with flies. Some of the impaled were still alive. Their groans drifted across the field like wind through dead trees. Soldiers doubled over and vomited. Janissaries who had scaled the walls of Constantinople turned their faces away. Mehmed sat motionless on his horse, staring at the geometric precision of the horror before him. This was not madness. This was calculation. Every stake was a message. Every corpse was a word in a language older than empires. The generals urged retreat. The army could not fight what it could not face. And for the first time in his 30 years of conquest, the Sultan, who had never known defeat, gave the order to turn back toward the Danube. And now, before this story unfolds further, may I take a small portion of your time and subscribe to this channel. Join thousands of history lovers on this journey through time. If this tale has earned your attention, a like and a comment go a long way. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? These stories have traveled centuries to reach you. Let us continue. The retreat was silent. No drums marked the march back to the Danube. No songs celebrated survival. 90,000 men moved through the ruined Wallachian landscape like ghosts, and at their center rode the conqueror of Constantinople, with something new carved into his face. In his command tent that night, Mehmed sat alone with maps. He did not study and wine, he did not drink. He had been 21 years old when he achieved what emperors and caliphs had failed to accomplish for 1,000 years. The walls of Constantinople had crumbled before his cannons. The last Byzantine emperor had died in the rubble. And now a prince of a backwater principality, a man with perhaps 30,000 soldiers, had made him turn his army around. The humiliation burned deeper because Mehmed knew exactly who Vlad was. The Sultan remembered the boy who had arrived at his father's court 2 decades earlier, a hostage sent to guarantee his own father's loyalty. Vlad had been perhaps 12, sullen and defiant, where his younger brother Radu was charming and eager to please. The Ottomans had educated both boys, trained them in warfare and politics and court intrigue. They had been investments, future puppets to be placed on the Wallachian throne whenever it suited Ottoman interests. Radu had become more Turkish than Wallachian. Beautiful, diplomatic, beloved by the court, and by Mehmed himself. When the Sultan needed a replacement for the monster he had created, the choice was obvious. Radu the Handsome would take his brother's throne. The announcement in Constantinople weeks later proclaimed victory. Wallachia had a new prince, loyal to the empire. The campaign had achieved its objectives. But in the coffee houses and barracks, men whispered what the official chronicles would never record. The conqueror had fled from one man, and somewhere in the Wallachian mountains, that man was still alive. The winter of 1431 brought heavy snow to the mountains of Transylvania, and in a fortress house on the stone streets of Sighishuara, a boy was born who would teach Europe the true meaning of terror. His father was Vlad, called Dracula, a name that meant dragon in the old tongue. The title came from the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood of Christian princes sworn before God to drive the Ottoman Turks from European soil. The elder Vlad wore the insignia everywhere, a serpent curled into a circle, wings spread, a cross blazing on its back. When his second son arrived in that cold December, the boy inherited more than blood. He inherited a name that would echo through centuries: Dracula, son of the dragon. The child grew in a world balanced on the edge of annihilation. Wallachia, the principality his father governed, was a strip of fertile land south of the Carpathian Mountains, blessed with rich soil and cursed by geography. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire, a force that had devoured kingdoms and threatened to swallow all of Christendom. To the west loomed the Kingdom of Hungary, hungry for influence and territory. To the north stretched Poland, always watching, always calculating. Every Wallachian prince walked a path between these powers with daggers at his throat from all directions. Survival demanded more than courage. It demanded the willingness to betray anyone, sacrifice anything, something beyond the constraints of ordinary morality. Young Vlad learned to walk on the cobblestones of Sighishuara, beneath church bells that rang for a faith under siege. He watched his father bow to Hungarian lords and send gold to Turkish sultans. He learned before he could fully understand that loyalty in this world was not a virtue, but a death sentence. The boys rode south with a Turkish escort in the autumn of 1442, and Vlad watched his homeland shrink behind him until the Carpathian peaks became shadows, and then nothing at all. He was 11 years old. His brother Radu was barely 8. Their father had summoned them to his chambers 3 days earlier and explained in careful, measured tones that they were gifts. The Sultan required guarantees of Wallachian loyalty, and what better guarantee than sons? The dragon kissed both boys on their foreheads and told them to be brave. He did not tell them when they would return. He did not know if they ever would. The crossing of the Danube felt like a passage between worlds. The river ran wide and brown beneath the ferry, and on the far bank the Ottoman Empire spread before them in a landscape of minarets and unfamiliar tongues. Radu cried the first night. Vlad did not. Something had already begun to harden behind his eyes, a shell forming around whatever softness remained. He understood now what his father was. Not a dragon, but a merchant, trading his own blood for another year on a throne that could be taken at any moment. The journey to Adrianople took weeks through lands that seemed to stretch forever. Vlad memorized everything: the way Turkish soldiers organized their camps, the discipline of their marches, the casual confidence of men who belonged to an empire that had never known true defeat. He was a prisoner dressed in fine clothes and addressed with courtesy, and he knew that courtesy would vanish the instant his father broke faith with the Sultan. The lesson sank into his bones like winter cold. Nothing was sacred. Not blood, not oaths, not the bond between father and son. Survival demanded the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone. Young Vlad learned it perfectly. The fortress at Adrianople held its hostages in comfort that never let them forget they were prisoners. Vlad and Radu lived in fine quarters with servants and tutors, and all the privileges of noble guests. But guards stood at every gate, and letters from home arrived already opened. The Ottomans did not waste their captives. They educated them. Vlad learned to ride in the Turkish style, controlling his mount with his knees while both hands wielded weapons. He studied military tactics under officers who had conquered more territory than all the Christian kingdoms combined. He learned Turkish and Arabic and the intricate protocols of court life. He observed how the Sultan administered an empire of millions through layers of bureaucracy and carefully calibrated terror. The terror fascinated him most. Public executions were common in Adrianople, and the Ottomans reserved impalement for the worst offenders. Traitors and rebels died on sharpened stakes, while crowds gathered to watch. Vlad studied the technique with the attention other boys gave to swordplay. He noted how the stake was oiled to slow the body's descent, how the angle determined whether death came in hours or days, how the positioning of the victim sent different messages to different audiences. He was filing away knowledge he did not yet know he would use. His brother found a different path. Radu was beautiful in a way that opened doors throughout the Ottoman court. He learned to charm where Vlad learned to observe. He adopted Turkish dress and Turkish manners, and perhaps Turkish faith. Whispers followed him through the palace corridors, suggestions that young Prince Mehmed had taken particular interest in the Wallachian boy. Whether the relationship was intimate or merely close, Radu flourished while Vlad suffered. Guards beat Vlad for defiance. Tutors threatened him with death for his stubborn Christianity. He bent under the pressure, learned to hide his hatred, but somewhere in his core, a furnace was building that would one day burn empires. The news arrived in fragments that winter, each piece worse than the last. Vlad was 16 when a Turkish official summoned him to a cold chamber and told him his father was dead. The dragon had trusted the wrong men. John Hunyadi, regent of Hungary and champion of Christendom, had lured him into Transylvania with promises of alliance. The ambush came in a marsh near Balteni. Wallachian boyars who had sworn loyalty turned their swords on their prince. They cut him down and left his body in the mud. But the true horror came next. Mircea, Vlad's older brother and heir to the throne, had been captured by the boyars of Targoviste. These were nobles who had feasted in his father's hall, who had kissed the dragon's ring and pledged their sacred honor. They took Mircea to the outskirts of the city. They heated iron stakes until they glowed, and they pressed those stakes into his eyes, blinding him slowly while he screamed. Then they buried him. Some accounts say he was already dead. Others say he was still breathing when the dirt covered his face. Vlad received these reports in his comfortable prison, surrounded by Turkish guards and Turkish tutors, unable to avenge his blood or mourn his dead. Something finished forming inside him during those weeks. The boy who had crossed the Danube 4 years earlier was gone entirely. In his place stood something harder, colder, patient as stone, and twice as merciless. The Ottomans recognized opportunity in his grief. A traumatized prince with legitimate claims to Wallachia could be useful. They released Vlad with Turkish soldiers and Turkish gold, expecting gratitude and obedience. They did not understand what they were unleashing. Vlad rode north toward his homeland with the names of his father's killers carved into his memory. The throne of Wallachia felt like a trap from the first moment Vlad sat upon it. He was 17 years old, installed by Turkish soldiers who expected him to rule as their instrument. The boyars who gathered in his court watched him with eyes that calculated his weakness. They had murdered his father. They had buried his brother alive. Now they bowed and smiled and waited to see which way the winds of power would blow. Vlad had no army of his own, only borrowed Ottoman troops who answered to their commanders rather than their puppet prince. He had no treasury, no network of loyal nobles, no foundation upon which to build anything lasting. He was a symbol rather than a sovereign, a name on documents that meant nothing beyond the reach of Turkish spears. The reign lasted 2 months. John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent who had orchestrated the dragon's murder, sent forces sweeping through Wallachia with a rival claimant at their head. Vlad's Ottoman protectors melted away rather than fight a serious campaign for a principality they considered expendable. The boyars who had bowed so gracefully shifted their allegiance without hesitation. Vlad fled before he could be captured and killed like his father and brother. He crossed into Ottoman territory and then into Moldavia, a prince without a principality, a ruler without a single soldier who owed him loyalty. The lesson was absolute. Turkish backing meant nothing without personal strength. Legitimacy meant nothing without the power to enforce it. If he ever returned to Wallachia, he would need more than a name and a claim. He would need to become something that could not be swept aside. 8 years of exile stretched before him. Vlad entered them as a failed puppet. He would emerge as something else entirely. 8 years taught Vlad the art of becoming invisible while remaining unforgotten. He drifted between courts like a ghost with a crown in his pocket, surviving on the hospitality of men who might kill him tomorrow and the promises of patrons who had murdered his family yesterday. Moldavia sheltered him first. His cousin Stephen was young and ambitious, and the two princes recognized something similar in each other. They trained together, planned together, dreamed of thrones they did not yet possess. Stephen would one day become Stephen the Great, a ruler who would make Moldavia a power that emperors respected. But in those early years, they were both exiles learning to sharpen themselves against each other. Transylvania came next, and then Hungary, where Vlad performed the most extraordinary transformation of his wandering years. John Hunyadi had orchestrated his father's death. The Hunyadi name should have been poison to any son of the dragon. Yet Vlad presented himself at the Hungarian court and carefully won the trust of Hunyadi's son Ladislaus. He bowed to men whose hands were stained with his father's blood. He smiled at jokes that must have curdled in his throat. He became useful, reliable, patient, beyond any reasonable expectation. The defiant boy who had been beaten in Ottoman prisons was gone. In his place stood a man who understood that vengeance required survival, and survival required masks. Vlad learned to wear his hatred beneath courtesy so perfect that no one suspected the calculations running behind his eyes. Every alliance was temporary. Every friendship was strategic. Every bow concealed a blade waiting for the proper moment. When Hunyadi launched a new crusade against the Ottomans, Vlad marched with Hungarian forces, fighting alongside the sons of his father's killers against the empire that had held him hostage. He was becoming exactly what Wallachia required. The summer of 1456 brought Vlad back to Wallachia with a Hungarian army at his back, and 8 years of patience sharpened into purpose. Vladislav II held the throne, the same prince who had been installed when Vlad fled into exile. He was a competent ruler, well-connected among the boyars, secure in his power. He did not expect his predecessor to return with sword in hand. The two princes met in battle near Targoviste. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances, but the outcome is certain. Vlad and Vladislav faced each other personally, blade against blade, and when the fighting ended, only one walked away. Vlad took his rival's head, and with it seized the throne for the second time. He was 25 years old. The boyars gathered to pay homage to their new prince, with the same smooth faces they had shown every ruler before him. These were the men who controlled the land and the peasants and the wealth of Wallachia. They had made and unmade princes for generations. They had smiled at his father and then arranged his murder. They had captured his brother and burned out his eyes and buried him breathing in the cold earth. Now they bowed and offered their loyalty, as if such words meant anything. Vlad accepted their oaths and watched their eyes. He recognized what they saw when they looked at him. Another young prince to be managed, another puppet to be controlled until he became inconvenient, then removed and replaced like all the others. They were already calculating which foreign power to court, which rival claimant to support, which moment would be perfect for betrayal. Vlad let them calculate. He had calculations of his own. The throne beneath him was soaked in generations of blood, and he understood with perfect clarity that he would either break the power of the boyars forever or join his father and brother in the ground. The invitation arrived with all the courtesy expected of a Christian prince, honoring the holiest day of the year. Every great boyar family received word that Vlad requested their presence at an Easter feast in Targovishte, a celebration of resurrection and renewal for all Wallachia. Hundreds answered the summons. Lords arrived in their finest robes, silks imported from Venice, embroidery threaded with gold. Ladies wore jewels that represented generations of accumulated wealth. Servants and retinues swelled the crowd until the great hall blazed with color and privilege. The feast was magnificent. Wine flowed from the prince's own cellars. Musicians played. Vlad presided over the celebration with graciousness that surprised those who remembered the sullen hostage who had returned from Turkish captivity. As the evening deepened, Vlad rose and posed a question to his assembled nobility. "How many princes have you served in your lifetimes?" The oldest boyars laughed and began to count. 5 princes. 6. 7. They wore their survival as a badge of pride, proof of their skill at navigating the treacherous waters of Wallachian politics. They had outlasted rulers who thought themselves secure. They would outlast this one, too. The doors sealed shut. Guards moved through the hall with precision that revealed weeks of planning. The oldest boyars, the ones who had served during the dragon's reign, were dragged from their seats and hauled into the courtyard. Stakes had already been planted in the ground. The screams began before the feast hall fell silent. Those who remained heard everything. The younger nobles and their families watched the doors and understood they were witnessing the death of their class. Vlad did not kill them. He marched them 50 miles north to a mountain where he was building a new fortress. They hauled stones until their Easter silks rotted from their bodies. They worked until they died. Poenari Castle rose on their bones. The stakes multiplied across Wallachia like a forest growing in unnatural haste. Vlad codified his justice with a simplicity that left no room for confusion or appeal. Theft meant impalement. Lying meant impalement. Adultery meant impalement. Laziness, begging, any deviation from the order Vlad envisioned, all earned the same punishment. Bodies lined the roads into Targovishte, and travelers learned to lower their eyes and quicken their pace. But something unexpected happened in the shadow of those stakes. Crime did not merely decrease, it virtually vanished. A golden cup appeared at a public fountain in Targovishte, placed there on Vlad's orders. Any citizen could use it to drink, but no one dared remove it. The cup sat untouched for years, gleaming in the sun beside water that anyone could take freely. It became a symbol of something Wallachia had never known before: absolute security, through absolute fear. Merchants who had suffered constant robbery under previous princes began to speak of Vlad with something approaching gratitude. They could travel roads without armed escorts. They could leave goods unguarded overnight. The thieves and bandits who had plagued commerce were rotting on stakes or had fled across the borders. Foreign visitors recorded their astonishment. Wallachia, long considered a lawless frontier, had become the safest country in Europe for anyone willing to obey the rules. The common people felt the change most keenly. Boyars could no longer abuse peasants without consequence. The old nobility had preyed on villages for generations, taking what they wanted, answering to no one. Now the stakes awaited any lord who forgot that Vlad's law applied to silk robes as readily as rags. The peasants watched their former tormentors die screaming and found it difficult to mourn. The merchant came from Florence, a man accustomed to the dangers of trade across foreign lands. He had accepted robbery as a cost of doing business, a tax levied by circumstance and lawlessness wherever weak princes failed to keep order. But when thieves took his goods on a Wallachian road, local officials urged him to bring his complaint directly to the prince. He expected nothing. Rulers made sympathetic noises and offered excuses. Merchants learned to absorb their losses and adjust their prices accordingly. Vlad listened to the Florentines' account without interruption. He asked precise questions about the location, the time, the nature of the stolen goods. Then he dismissed the merchant with instructions to wait in the town until the matter was resolved. Within days, soldiers brought a man to the public square. The thief had been found through methods the merchant preferred not to imagine. The stake was already waiting. The merchant watched a man die slowly for stealing his property and felt something between satisfaction and horror. That evening, a servant arrived at his lodgings with a purse. The prince had ordered full restitution. The merchant counted the coins by candlelight, once and then again. The sum exceeded what had been taken. One extra gold piece lay among the others, too precise to be an accident. He returned to the palace and presented the additional coin to Vlad, explaining that the prince's generosity had exceeded the actual loss. Vlad's expression did not change. He told the merchant that the extra coin had been a test. Had the Florentine kept what was not rightfully his, he would have joined the thief on a stake of his own. The merchant left Wallachia wealthy and alive, carrying stories he would tell for the rest of his years about a prince whose justice recognized no distinction between crimes great and small. 3 years of performed submission purchased the time Vlad needed. He paid the tribute demanded by Constantinople, gold and boys sent south to feed an empire's hunger. He attended diplomatic functions with appropriate deference. He played the loyal vassal so convincingly that Ottoman officials reported no cause for concern from the Wallachian frontier. But behind the mask of obedience, preparations advanced with relentless purpose. Engineers strengthened the fortifications along the Danube, transforming crossing points into death traps. Vlad raised a new army recruited from free peasants and minor nobles, men who owed their positions entirely to him rather than to boyar tradition. These soldiers drilled constantly, learning to fight in the Turkish style Vlad had studied during his captivity. Messengers traveled secret routes to Hungary, to Venice, to Rome itself. Vlad proposed a grand Christian alliance against the Ottoman threat. He promised to be the sword point of the crusade if others would provide support. Some listened. Some offered vague encouragement. None committed fully. But Vlad was already past the point of waiting for permission. In 1461, the tribute caravans stopped. Constantinople noticed immediately. Ambassadors arrived in Targoviste with demands for payment and explanations for the dangerous silence. Vlad received them with elaborate hospitality. When the envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing the requirements of their faith, Vlad expressed understanding. He would help them keep their turbans on forever. His guards seized the ambassadors and brought hammers and iron nails. The turbans were fixed permanently to the skulls beneath them. The envoys were placed on horses and sent back toward Constantinople, bleeding and screaming, carrying a message no words could have delivered more clearly. Vlad Dracula had declared war on the most powerful empire in the world. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube in the early summer of 1462, a force so vast that observers struggled to count its true strength. Estimates ranged from 90,000 to 150,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force the empire had ever assembled against a Christian enemy. Sultan Mehmed rode at its head, determined to personally crush the vassal who had dared to nail his ambassadors' turbans to their skulls. Vlad had perhaps 30,000 men. He knew that meeting the Ottomans in open battle meant annihilation. Instead, he offered them a wasteland. Wells were poisoned before the advancing army could drink from them. Villages were burned before they could provide shelter. Crops were destroyed in the fields. The Wallachians melted into forests and mountains, striking supply lines and stragglers before vanishing again. Ottoman soldiers began dying of thirst and disease before they ever saw an enemy formation. On the night of June 17th, Vlad gathered between 7,000 and 10,000 of his best cavalry for a strike that could end the war in hours. They rode toward the Ottoman camp in darkness, their horses' hooves muffled, their approach masked by the chaos of an army too large to properly secure its perimeters. The objective was Mehmed himself, kill the Sultan, and the invasion would collapse into succession struggles. The attack exploded through the camp like a storm breaking without warning. Sleeping soldiers died before they could reach their weapons. Fires erupted across the sea of tents. Vlad's cavalry carved through the confusion toward the imperial pavilions at the center. They found elaborate tents and slaughtered the occupants, cutting down 2 grand viziers in the darkness. But Mehmed was elsewhere, protected by confusion and luck. Dawn forced Vlad to withdraw with perhaps 15,000 enemy dead behind him, and the Sultan still breathing. The Ottoman column had marched through devastation for weeks, but nothing prepared them for what waited outside the walls of Targovishte. The smell announced itself first, a sweetness that crept into nostrils and lungs and refused to leave. Soldiers who had conquered cities and witnessed massacres began to gag on air that seemed to coat their throats with death. Then came the crows. They rose from the horizon in numbers that defied belief. Thousands upon thousands of black shapes wheeling against the pale sky, their cries drowning conversation and command alike. The column slowed as men struggled to process what their eyes reported. Stakes stretched across the landscape in rows so precise they might have been planted by surveyors. 20,000 bodies hung upon them in varying stages of decay. The geometry was deliberate, a hierarchy of suffering arranged for maximum impact. Ottoman prisoners occupied the center, their military ranks still identifiable by the remnants of their uniforms. Wallachian boyars and their families lined the flanks, nobles who had attempted to negotiate with the invaders now rotting in their finery. Some victims were fresh enough that their features remained recognizable. Others had bloated beyond human shape. Some were still alive, their moans drifting across the field like wind through a forest of flesh. Mehmed the Conqueror sat motionless on his horse at the edge of this vision. He had broken the walls of Constantinople. He had ended an empire that had endured 1,000 years. He had never imagined that a prince of a minor principality could create something that would make his battle-hardened janissaries weep and vomit. The generals urged retreat before plague spread through the ranks. The army's morale had shattered completely. Mehmed gave the order to withdraw, leaving behind a wasteland and a prince who had achieved an impossible victory through methods that would haunt European memory for centuries. Mehmed understood that empires could be conquered by patience as easily as by force. The Sultan withdrew his battered army toward the Danube, but he left behind a weapon more dangerous than any cannon. Radu rode at the head of a modest Turkish force, with letters patent naming him the rightful prince of Wallachia, and promises designed to undo everything his brother had built. Where Vlad offered stakes, Radu offered mercy. Where Vlad demanded total loyalty, Radu suggested compromise. Where Vlad burned and killed and terrified, Radu smiled and negotiated and charmed. The message spread through a country exhausted by years of total war. Boyars who had hidden in their estates, waiting to see which side would triumph, began emerging to pledge their support to the gentler brother. Radu promised them their lands, their privileges, their traditional powers. He promised to be the kind of prince Wallachia had known before Vlad transformed the throne into an instrument of terror. City after city opened its gates without resistance. Targovishte itself wavered as citizens calculated the cost of continued loyalty. Peasants who had cheered Vlad's destruction of the boyar class now faced conscription into endless war against an empire that would never stop sending armies. Radu offered peace. He offered an end to the bleeding. He offered something that felt like normalcy after years of living in the shadow of the stakes. Even soldiers who had ridden with Vlad on the night attack began slipping away to join his brother. The defections accelerated as autumn approached, each departure making the next more likely. Vlad watched his country abandon him not through conquest, but through exhaustion. His own people had finally grown tired of being saved through methods that made salvation feel like another form of damnation. The fortress of Poenari clung to its mountain peak like a last desperate hope. Vlad had built it with boyar bones, raised its walls with the labor of nobles who had worked until their Easter silks rotted away, and their bodies followed. Now, it would serve its final purpose as a refuge for a prince whose kingdom had crumbled beneath him. Radu's forces climbed the river valley and spread across the lower slopes, too numerous to count in the autumn mist. Turkish banners flew beside the standards of Wallachian boyars, who had chosen the gentler brother. The siege would be slow, but inevitable. No relief was coming. No ally would risk war with the Ottoman Empire for a prince who had already lost. The woman who stood at the tower window has no name in surviving records. History remembers only that she was Vlad's wife, and that she watched the army gathering below with eyes that calculated futures worth avoiding. Capture meant Constantinople. It meant becoming a trophy, a bargaining piece, an instrument of her husband's humiliation. The Argesh River churned white against the rocks far below the battlements. According to tradition, she spoke before she jumped. She declared that she would rather have her body rot and be eaten by the fish than be led into captivity by the Turks. Then she fell. Vlad was not there to witness it. Some accounts say he learned of her death hours later. Others say he never knew for certain what happened. What is documented is his escape through mountain passages known only to those who had built the fortress. He descended through darkness, while his kingdom burned behind him, leaving wife and throne and everything he had constructed through blood and terror. Only survival remained, and even that felt more like curse than blessing. The King of Hungary welcomed Vlad as a fugitive and kept him as a prisoner. Matthias Corvinus had received papal gold and Venetian silver to launch a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, funds that had quietly disappeared into Hungarian coffers, while the Misamsun promised armies never materialized. Now the one Christian prince who had actually fought the Turks stood in his court, a living accusation of broken promises and embezzled crusade money. Vlad expected soldiers and support for reconquest. He received chains and a tower cell. Forged letters appeared at convenient moments, documents allegedly proving that Vlad had secretly negotiated with Sultan Mehmed, that the great defender of Christendom was actually a Turkish agent. The forgeries were clumsy, but they served their purpose. Matthias could point to evidence of treachery, while the real traitor wore a crown and spent church money on Hungarian palaces. 12 years dissolved in captivity. The first years were harsh, a prisoner held in close confinement with guards who remembered the stories of impalement. But time softened the conditions gradually. Vlad converted to Catholicism, abandoning the Orthodox faith of his fathers. He married a Hungarian noblewoman, possibly a cousin of the king himself. Children came, sons who would never know the mountain fortress or the field of stakes. Visitors to his later imprisonment reported strange behaviors. Vlad captured birds that landed near his windows and mice that crept through his chambers. He fashioned tiny wooden stakes and impaled them with the same precision he had once applied to boyars and Ottoman prisoners. Guards whispered about madness, but perhaps it was simply practice. The hands that had terrorized an empire stayed busy with smaller victims, maintaining skills that might yet find use if fortune ever turned again. The prisoner emerged from Hungarian captivity like a ghost returning to haunt the living. Radu the Handsome was dead, claimed by disease that some whispered was the French pox. His beauty rotted away along with his brief reign. The Turkish puppet who replaced him proved weak and unpopular, unable to manage the boyars or defend the borders. Suddenly, Hungary needed the monster it had caged for 12 years. Matthias Corvinus released Vlad with soldiers and gold and instructions to reclaim his throne. The man who rode south toward Wallachia in 1474 was not the prince who had created the forest of the dead. 12 years had carved lines into his face and gray into his hair. He was past 40 now, old by the standards of an age when men died young from war and disease and the countless small infections that medicine could not treat. His new wife remained in Hungary with their children, hostages to his good behavior as he had once been hostage to the Turks. Stephen of Moldavia, his cousin and old friend, sent troops to support the invasion. The campaign itself proved swift and brutal, the old skills still sharp despite years of disuse. The Turkish-backed prince fled before Vlad's advancing forces, unwilling to face what everyone knew would be merciless judgment. In November of 1476, Vlad entered Targovishte for the third time as its prince. The throne felt familiar beneath him, but the kingdom had changed, and perhaps he had changed with it. Chronicles from this brief period record fewer impalements, more conventional acts of governance. Whether age had softened him or imprisonment had broken something essential, the terror that had defined his earlier reign did not fully return. His army was small, his treasury was empty, his allies were distant. 2 months remained. The end came in the frozen borderlands near Bucharest, where the year 1476 bled into 1477. The precise circumstances remain contested by history, appropriately obscured for a man whose life had already begun transforming into legend. What is certain is that Vlad rode to battle against Ottoman forces, or perhaps Turkish-backed Wallachian rebels, the distinction blurring in a country where loyalty shifted like winter wind. The accounts fracture from there. Some chronicles describe assassination by boyar traitors who had never forgiven the Easter massacre and saw their chance at vengeance. Others tell of chaos in battle, Vlad cut down by his own soldiers who mistook his Turkish-style armor and combat techniques for the enemy he had learned them from. Still others paint a valiant last stand, the impaler fighting to his final breath against overwhelming numbers. All versions agree on what followed. Someone took his head. The body was buried, perhaps at Snagov Monastery on an island in a lake north of Bucharest, perhaps somewhere else entirely. But the head traveled south along roads Vlad had once ridden as a hostage child. It crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory and continued to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed waited to receive proof that his nightmare had ended. The conqueror was old now, ill with ailments that would claim him within 2 years. He had the head preserved in honey and displayed where the empire could witness the fate of those who defied Ottoman power. 2 monsters faced each other in that moment, one a trophy in amber sweetness, and one a dying emperor savoring final victory. Neither would see another year turn. The dragon's son was dead at 45, leaving behind a devastated kingdom, a terrified legend, and questions that 6 centuries would fail to answer. The printing press had transformed Europe barely a generation before Vlad's death, and his legend became one of its first sensations. German publishers discovered that horror sold copies faster than any sermon or chronicle, and the tale of Dracula proved irresistible to readers hungry for terror. Pamphlets rolled off presses in Nuremberg and Strasbourg and spread across the German-speaking world with illustrations that burned themselves into popular imagination. Woodcuts depicted scenes of elaborate cruelty, bodies writhing on stakes while a mustachioed figure dined contentedly among the dying. Stories multiplied with each retelling. Vlad nailing turbans to skulls became Vlad nailing hats to anyone who displeased him. His methodical elimination of the boyar class became random massacres of innocents. Tales emerged of him dipping bread in the blood of victims, skinning merchants alive, roasting children, and forcing parents to eat them. Some accounts contained kernels of truth buried beneath layers of embellishment. Others were pure invention, designed to thrill and horrify. The Saxon merchants of Transylvania funded much of this propaganda. Vlad had raided their towns, impaled their people, disrupted their profitable trade. They had resources and motive to ensure his memory would be cursed for generations. But the pamphlets succeeded because Europe was already primed for a monster. Ottoman armies threatened Vienna itself, and the terror that kept Westerners awake at night needed a face. Vlad became both nightmare and strange comfort, proof that the Turks could be defeated if Christians embraced sufficient ruthlessness. Meanwhile, different stories traveled east. Russian manuscripts described a harsh but righteous prince who punished corruption and protected common people from aristocratic predation. The same man was demon and hero, his legacy splitting along lines that would never fully reconcile. Wallachia endured centuries of Ottoman domination after Vlad's death, its princes reduced to tax collectors for Constantinople, its independence a memory preserved in chronicles few could read. Vlad himself faded into the background of history, one brutal ruler among dozens who had briefly held the throne before falling to assassination or exile. His name appeared in documents and church records, but inspired no particular reverence or condemnation. The transformation began when Romanian intellectuals of the 19th century started constructing a national identity from fragments of medieval history. They needed heroes who had resisted foreign powers, princes who embodied Romanian courage against impossible odds. Vlad emerged from obscurity as precisely what the nationalist project required. The impalements were reframed as harsh justice necessary for survival. The boyar massacres became righteous punishment of traitors who had sold their country to foreign masters. The terror that had made Mehmed retreat was celebrated as proof that Romanians could humble empires when properly led. By the 20th century, Vlad had completed his resurrection from historical footnote to national symbol. Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist dictator who ruled Romania with his own brand of ruthless control, embraced the impaler as a predecessor worth honoring. Statues rose in town squares. Schools taught children about the prince who had defended Romanian soil against Turkish aggression. The German pamphlets were dismissed as foreign propaganda designed to slander a patriot. Two Vlads now existed in permanent tension. Western audiences knew the monster who dined among corpses. Romanian audiences celebrated the defender who had sacrificed his soul to save his people. Neither version captured the full complexity of a man shaped by forces that demanded transformation into something beyond ordinary morality. The London fog pressed against windows of a cluttered study where an Irish theatre manager labored over a novel that would not quite come together. Bram Stoker had spent years gathering notes on vampires, collecting folklore from Eastern Europe, sketching a monster who would embody Victorian anxieties about blood and death and foreign corruption. His vampire needed a name, something that would chill readers before they even opened the book. The original drafts called him Count Wampir, a title that felt flat and forgettable. Then Stoker discovered a book on Wallachian history in the Whitby Library during a seaside holiday. He encountered the name Dracula and learned it meant son of the dragon. The word carried centuries of accumulated dread, echoes of pamphlets that had terrified German readers 400 years earlier. Stoker scratched out Wampir and wrote Dracula instead. The Count who emerged from his manuscript bore almost no resemblance to the historical prince. Stoker's Dracula was Transylvanian rather than Wallachian, an aristocrat of ancient refinement rather than a warlord who had built fortresses with slave labor. He seduced rather than impaled, his violence intimate rather than spectacular. The suave creature in evening dress shared nothing with the man who had dined among forests of the dying, except a name and a capacity for terror. Yet that name proved powerful enough to consume everything else. Within decades, Dracula meant only the vampire, the historical prince forgotten beneath layers of films and novels and Halloween costumes. Vlad achieved immortality of a kind he could never have imagined. His identity dissolved into fiction, while his actual deeds faded from popular memory. Perhaps there is justice in this strange afterlife. He had wanted to be feared, and 5 centuries later his name still carries darkness. Tourists arrive in Romania seeking Dracula and find a country uncertain how to package its most famous son. Bran Castle rises photogenically in the Transylvanian mountains, its towers and battlements perfectly matching vampire film aesthetics. Gift shops sell plastic fangs and capes. Guides recite tales of the undead count. The castle itself has almost no connection to Vlad, who likely never spent a single night within its walls. Meanwhile, his true fortress crumbles in obscurity. Poenari requires a climb of 1,480 steps up a mountainside where boyars once hauled stones until they died. Few tourists make the journey. Those who do find ruins open to the sky, walls that have surrendered to centuries of weather and neglect, a monument to a man history transformed into someone else entirely. Historians still argue across conference tables and academic journals. Some count the dead and call him monster without qualification. Others weigh his crimes against the alternatives, noting that Wallachia maintained independence while larger kingdoms fell. His methods were undeniably horrific, but his enemies employed horrors of their own. He killed tens of thousands, but he also created order from chaos and faced down an empire that seemed invincible. The debate never resolves because Vlad himself refuses simple categories. He was shaped by abandonment and captivity, by watching his brother buried alive, by years as a hostage learning Turkish methods of control. He became what his world required for survival, something beyond conventional morality, something that could make the conqueror of Constantinople turn his army around. The impalement field outside Targoviste stood in the summer heat of 1462. 20,000 bodies arranged with geometric precision, and the greatest military force in the world retreated from one man's capacity for terror. History remembers the legend, but the truth needs no embellishment.